Welcome, and thanks for hanging out with me right now as we talk about podcasts, how to get on them, how to be a sought after podcast guest. We're going to go over some do's and don'ts in looking for podcasts and reaching out and what to do after your episode has been published. But first, I'm Lisbeth Meredith. Find me at lameredith.com or Persistence U podcast with Lisbeth. That's U as in university. It's not like YOU. And the thing is, I have been as an author on scores of podcasts. And some point in my writing journey, I became a podcaster. So I've seen it from both sides of things. And I just want to give you a little background because a lot of people reach out to podcasters and never hear back. And here's why. It's not you, it's us. There are more than 800,000 podcasts right now. That's a lot of podcasts. And there are more than 1,000 books being published every single day. Not everyone who wants to be on a podcast is an author, but a heck of a lot of people are. And so the odds are kind of stacked against us. And what I see, and I've done it myself before, what I see people doing often is just throwing their name in the hat of a podcast without even checking to see if they're accepting yes, without listening to the show to see if it even is a fit for them, or aiming for the stars when they're just starting out. Sometimes it's a good idea to start small and build yourself up as a podcast guest. So let's go over it just a little bit. Okay, so here you are. You are a writer. You want to get on a podcast. There are a number of things that you can do. First of all, you have to ask yourself, what is your story? What kind of things are you wanting to share about? And how does that align with the person whose podcast you're looking to be on? Podcast guests often forget, I have found, that it is the podcast host who is paying the money. It costs to record a podcast. It costs human time, at least 10 to 15 hours each episode, to put together a podcast, to create show notes, to create promos, to create sound bites, to create social media images. It's a lot of work. And so I think sometimes guests feel as though, like, hey, you're lucky to have me. And while you're at it, why don't you put my book up on your website? And why don't you review my book? Here's my book, and why don't you read it? It's just important to know the podcast host is, even if they're not killing it, if they're not doing the greatest job in the world, they're probably working a full-time job and doing other things like writing themselves in addition to hosting their podcast. So it's just good to know that. A couple of the things, I'll start with the negative and go toward the positive. A few things over the years that I've noticed is that potential podcast guests, as I mentioned before, sometimes will have themselves or they will enlist the help of someone, probably pretty cheaply, to reach out to podcasts with a form letter. And it goes like this. Hey, I like what you're doing with the show. And I think your guest would really like to hear from me. I want to talk about my new book that's coming out, and here are the links to it. Let me know what you think. Worse, I have people, and this happens to me every month. Someone will reach out to me on social media and say, here's a link to my website. Would you like me on your show? So they're asking me to stop everything, leave where I was inside of my own social media, go to an external link to do the work that they should have done. And so that is kind of frustrating. Another thing, sometimes potential podcast guests are very excited at the idea of being on a show. When it comes time to having that show be released, and it can be, depending on the show, it could be anywhere between a week to a year from the time of the interview. When the podcast host reaches out to say your episode is live, here are the links to the podcast. Here are the social media posts I'm hoping you'll share. And or if you don't have social media, here's something you can text to your friends to help partner with me to get people to listen to the podcast. We don't ever hear back. We don't hear a thank you for your time. We don't hear, hey, when was this? I mean, we don't hear anything. It's like crickets. That's so frustrating. What us hosts are looking for is someone who's listened to our show, who likes our show, who believes that they can bring value to our listeners. And I repeat that they could bring value to our listeners. What they're not interested in doing is getting on a podcast and trying to sell a product like their book. They will, of course, have their website mentioned. And of course, this increases the chance of their book being sold. But their goal as an ideal podcast guest is to serve the listeners of the podcast that they have pitched. And that needs to be abundantly clear. No form letters that cover one size fits all. No, I like what you're doing with this. That's too generic. Just listen to the show. Make sure it's something that you could provide value to. And for authors, a lot of times they want to talk about, let's say if they've written a novel, a historical romance, maybe they're going to be listening to, looking at which podcasts cover historical romance. But let's not forget that a lot of author shows, if you're an indie author, as an example, there are a number of podcasts you can look up where indie authors get to chime in about their writing experience. What do audiences like most to hear about? They love to hear about your failures. We want to know how you succeeded, sure, but we want you to show us the good, the bad, and definitely the ugly. Our human brain is wired toward a more negative. We respond better to negativity. It's sad but true. So don't hesitate to let us know the time you did a reading and no one showed up at Barnes & Noble. Let us know about the time that you misspelled a name 5 times in the manuscript and the editor missed it. Whatever it is, let us know the human journey behind this story. I love to let my guests know I'm interested in the story behind your story. And so please be vulnerable. Please do not come with notes, handwritten notes, not helpful. When somebody has written notes, so I do not send questions in advance any longer. Because what inevitably happens is my wonderful guest will get nervous, write out the answers, and you can literally hear the crinkle or see it in the background where the person is reading my question and then reading their answer. We just want to have a conversation. We want to hear the real you. And do you say and well, that's something you can work on, but that's fine. Just hearing your wonderful self is the best. During this time of AI, when so many things are artificial intelligence and bots and all the things, and hey, they can be very helpful. I created a list today using AI, so I'm not against it. But what we need as authors, as writers, is for people to know us, to like us, and to trust us. And the way to do that is by being our authentic self and letting someone hear our voice, our emotion, even the words that all of us repeat over and over and over. Most all of us have words that we use too frequently. Mine is lovely. That's one of them. Love. That's another word. I mean, these are not negative words, but nobody needs to hear it 10 times in an episode. So knowing what words you use too often is good because you might want to change that eventually, but it's okay. It's part of who you are. And we want your quirky, wonderful self. We want you to be human. Tell us about you. Tell us the story behind the story and answer whatever the host is asking. I think sometimes I've asked questions and this doesn't happen too often anymore, but the interviewer or the guest will answer a question that must have come out of the middle of their brain. Like they're thinking something else, and so they just answer something that is seemingly unrelated to what I just asked them. That's fine. It's not the end of the world, but, just trying to remember we're having a conversation here, just like you and me right now. We're having a conversation. So, except for I'm doing all the talking, so that's actually not true. So remember that I would not be adding automatically your podcast host to your email list if you have one on a website. If you have an integrated website, do not add anybody's email address without being, without them opting in, hopefully a double opt-in, but certainly don't do it without their permission. I've had that happen a good bit where I end up on these email lists that I didn't sign up for, and I just opt out, but it's very presumptuous. And as a host, I would be in a better position to do it because as a podcast host, I have, in theory, done the guest a favor. I wouldn't do that to them. They are always welcome in my community, and they don't have to be in my community. So, not just a template, but do think about each individual podcast that you're thinking about. Think about what their listeners need. And as you're creating your pitch, I'll show you a form in just a second. But let's look at a few different top points that you can think about that you would like to share that you believe would benefit their audience. That's the key. You want to collaborate with the podcaster to increase listener satisfaction. Of course, knowing details about the podcast is helpful. So I don't any longer meet with podcast guests in advance of our interview because what I learned was they would tell me the best stories and they will have told them all. And then when we get ready to record, they've already told them. So don't think to bring them up again. And no matter what I would do to prompt them, it was already gone. Like the gold stuff was gone. So what I did was I have a podcast scheduling link. A lot of people are doing this where it explains the podcast. And in my link, it'll say, hey, it's not a political podcast, not a religious podcast. Doesn't mean I don't want people to share about their faith. It means I don't want people to be divisive or speak in acronyms or proselytize in any form on my podcast. And so, I've explained that there. This is also a place where we're going to be on YouTube as well as wherever you listen to podcasts. So they know they might brush their teeth that morning. They don't have to. I'm going to love them regardless. But they might want to if it matters to them. I'm going to tell them how long that interview is so that they're not shocked if it turns out to be 20 minutes, but they were banking on an hour. And by the way, most listeners are ditching long podcasts unless they're constantly bringing amazing value. Long podcasts, it's hard to keep someone's attention that long. And so I'm going to the 20 to 30 minute range for my interviews, but just know whatever your podcast host is doing. I went to one recently and it was like an hour and a half. And then they broke it up into 2 different episodes. That's fine. They let me know in advance as I was a guest, and I loved it. Fantastic. Sometimes your host will ask you, is there anything you want me not to mention? Vice versa, if there's something you definitely don't want shared or you definitely want to avoid a topic, let them know in advance, maybe in an email if they've accepted. And by the way, they will typically give you that scheduling link. Like I use Zoom, some people use other things, but be sure you know where you're going the day of. Is it a Zoom link? Is it Squadcast? What is it? Is it StreamYard? Does that even exist anymore? I'm not sure. But whatever it is, be sure that you're ready and able to connect in that format. Some of the, I don't want to say devices, some of the software is not interfacing with all of the search engines. So you want to find out in advance if the thing that they use is not friendly with, let's say, Safari or not friendly with Yahoo or whatever it is that you use. So find that out and have those links ready. I get nervous even years later. I get nervous when I'm about to be on a podcast. And so having that information in my calendar is really important. So I know which link to press. Yay. And the next thing is remember, it's a conversation. So one frustration, I used to meet with people, like I said before, I used to meet with people in advance of recording the podcast. And I tried really hard to tell people, if you're selling, as an example, a coaching program, or you're selling a book, please don't. Just stop. Because really, the listener needs to get to know, like, and trust you. And then they're going to want to know about that book, which we will wind around to. We will. And they're going to want to spend time with you. And they may say, man, I would love to do coaching with this guest. I'm going to check out her link. But let the host be in charge of bringing some of that up. I met with one woman who got so nervous. She's delightful. She wrote a fabulous book. But I had said to her, if you go on a podcast and you say, well, if the listeners would read my book, well, in my book, it says, well, at the end of my book, it's obnoxious. And frankly, nobody is going to buy it at that point because they're tired of hearing the infomercial, and podcasts are not meant to be an infomercial. I'm going to show you an example of a fabulous podcast that I listened to this last week and to explain what I love about it. And it's just the antithesis of what I described. The host, who's well known actually, but so gracious, worked very hard to make sure she brought value to the audience. And she kept her answers within the timeline, but she had a new book released. You would never know it. You would never know that she had just re-released one of her books on the very topic she was speaking of, because she was so excited about the topic she was speaking of that she let her enthusiasm draw people in. And so in show notes, and when the host dipped around and said, hey, where can people find out more about you and your books? You better believe with that fabulous interview, people felt like they knew, liked, and trusted her, and would go to her site and say, oh my gosh, this is where she gives more information. I am going to order this book. And she never once mentioned it to order it. It's pretty amazing. It really was. So let me see here. I'm going to share my screen and hope I pick up the right thing because I always have too many things open. Oh, good. So the guide to successful podcast guesting for authors, I'm going to give this to you in an attachment. You will want to do your research. So one of the ways you can do research for podcasts is, and I used to mention this, if you are an author and you know what your also bots are, let's say you've sold enough books in Barnes and Noble or Amazon or at independent bookstores, you know what people are comparing your book to. Find out where that author is getting guested. If you are a brand new author or you've done less than, let's say, 25 podcast interviews, so that's still kind of new, do start with a small audience. Don't say to yourself, I'm only going to pitch really popular podcasts, because you want to get practice being interviewed. So look at podcasts and figure out who is out there and the topics that you're writing on. Are you writing nonfiction and maybe something about suicide or substance abuse, or maybe pet corgis even? Go ahead and research under your search engine podcasts on corgis, podcasts on substance abuse, whatever you like there. Or go under Amazon, look under bestsellers, because even if you don't order from Amazon, if you hate them, that's fine. But they are still the largest bookstore and search engine in the world at this time. I think it will change, but for right now, put in the search engine at Amazon those topics that your book is about and see what comes up as some of the best sellers, and where the author then. I take the author's name and say, okay, author's name is Mickey Mouse. So Mickey Mouse and substance abuse podcasts. And I can either look under a podcast search engine on my smartphone, like right here. I would look here. Or would I look under Amazon itself? Number of options, but do your research. Make sure that the host is accepting guests. Are they wanting guests right now? And make sure that your message aligns with their audience. Keep your pitch that you write them. We'll have a sample pitch, brief and impactful. A short 3 to 5 sentence or less than 400 word pitch that explains who you are, your unique angle, and why it's a good fit is far more effective than rambling on and on and on. If you've won awards and you've done this and done that or whatever, go lightly, because I can only tell you that I tend to be very put off with people who have bios that list every good thing they've ever done. For a podcast, it sounds very self-important to me. But if you have a big social media following, absolutely let the host know that you would maximize their podcast interview in and by putting it in front of your 25,000 guests or 25,000 friends on Instagram or whatever they're called. I have today someone after this episode, after this recording, who's going to be on, and she is, I'm going to say 35,000 people on Instagram. So she's a mini influencer. And that's helpful if the person is actually intending on putting this podcast episode in front of them. And so do put that. Mention if you have any credibility markers, like, or if you're like a New York Times bestseller, go ahead and do put that. You just don't want to go on and on and on and on. Let them know briefly who you are, why you're good to talk to their audience, what the audience will gain. And just don't send those generic spammy pitches. Don't say something like, I love your podcast. Don't pretend that you've done something. You don't say you've listened when you haven't. And hosts can typically see through that. Most hosts receive a ton of generic publicist-written pitches, and we do ignore them. We don't have enough time in the day to even write a nice, no, this is why this doesn't fit. So this means that if the podcast show means something to you, and if it fits, in other words, it fits your audience and you fit their audience. This is not a best top of the pop podcast, right? Because if you're starting small and your platform is like less than 100,000 people, then, maybe you want to start a little smaller, but reach out to them. It's a good fit. You've written a wonderful pitch to them. A week later or two, you might reach out one more time with the original email and just say in the subject line, checking up on my pitch. And that reminds me, I'll give you the paperwork in a little bit, but in the pitch subject line, you're going to want to be really clear what you're pitching. Just a few words, make them impactful, make sure that they're not the kind of thing that's so generic that someone's going to shake their head and just hit delete. If you haven't heard back from that podcast host after a while, you'll know that no answer is an answer. And that's okay. That's nothing about you. That is not personal. That doesn't mean you're not interesting. It just means for them right now, no. And so you don't want to pitch podcasts that don't feature guests. And so that's really important. You don't want to stray off topic very far. Okay. Pitching yourself as an expert in unrelated fields or inflating your credentials actually hurts your credibility. I know you wouldn't do that, but it can happen, and it does happen. Pitch yourself. Impersonal agents, I really don't like most agents to pitch me. I don't trust that I'm going to get a very interesting person on the other end of it. I have an agent, they tend to send spammy, generic emails, and I have only found one that I really like, and I've taken several of her guests. But I always tell her, when it comes time to sign up for the podcast, it needs to be the actual person, because she or he needs to read what my guidelines are inside of my Calendly link. So be sure that you are personally invested, and it's better coming from you than them. And here's some best practices for writing a podcast pitch via email. I'm going to give this to you, and I know you can read it, so I'm going to skim through that. And finding relevant podcasts, we have a section on that. I often hear from people, I'm too introverted. I can't do this. This is so uncomfortable, blah, blah, blah. Well, don't do it. If you don't want to do it and you're going to be miserable, please don't, because it's just not worth it if you're going to be miserable. But if it's a skill you want to get and grow, practice is going to make a lot of progress. And you may find, no matter how shy or introverted you typically are, it's fun to have a conversation with a podcast host. You may find I've had friendships develop from being a podcast host and a guest. And so if you could just think about it as if you get accepted to be a podcast guest, think about it in terms of I'm having a conversation with this one person. I'm just going to remember that they want my best. They're not usually an aha type of a journalist. They just want to ask questions, and we're going to get to know each other and serve the audience. It can take the nerves away and make it a lot of fun. Be sure that you, especially if you've promised the podcast host after they've published your episode, if you've said, I'm going to share it with my audience, be sure that you do via maybe your newsletter list, or is it social media, or both. You don't have either. You'll text it to 10 people, the link to your podcast episode, and ask them to share it with their friends. Do be a partner in marketing the podcast. It's expensive for the host to cover everything, and they're making it possible that people can know, like, and trust you. And so we want to make sure that you get invited back, or that podcast host will say to their other podcasting friends, because we belong to podcasting networks, hey, such and such would be perfect for your show, I think. Do you want me to introduce you via email? So if a guest, and I hate to say it, this doesn't happen almost ever, but if a guest is particularly bad or unkind, podcast hosts do share that too. So I know that you wouldn't do that, but it's just important to remember, we're all trying to support one another. And as a guest, you're supporting the listeners. But because marketing goes like this for books, people usually have to see something 3 to 5 times before they're going to buy it. They're not going to listen typically to one interview and say, you know what? I'm buying that book. That was great. Normally they see it, maybe in an advertisement or in social media. They hear about it from a friend. They listen to your podcast interview. They have a connection to your voice. Sometimes if it's on YouTube, to your face, and they will go ahead and not simply maybe buy the book that you're selling, whatever it is, but they may be signing up for the next thing that you do. This is how relationships begin. This is how community is developed. So I'm going to give you a link to the podcast called, let's see, what is it called? Novel Marketing Podcast. And it's a particular interview with a brilliant podcast author, and she's a podcast host also, Joanna Penn from the United Kingdom, Penn. The thing I love about this interview is, well, number one, I love that this podcast host is very, very, very traditional, very Christian. He lives in Texas, and he writes Christian, I think he writes Christian fiction, maybe nonfiction, but he helps authors who do so, even if he's not writing right now. Very dynamic podcast host. And he reaches out to Joanna Penn, who's very much, if not an atheist, very agnostic in the United Kingdom. They don't worry about stuff that could divide them. They have information that could benefit their listeners. And they have the most upbeat and adorable and fun conversation. At no point do you hear her say, buy my book. Oh, my book's almost out on this very topic. Oh, I was writing this book, and it's no. She's sharing valuable information. They're geeking out on AI and its role in marketing books, or, and some other things that authors may care about. And it's a wonderful listen. I really enjoy it. It's upbeat. It serves the audience. And she understands that people will know, like, and trust her. And in this world of robots and AI, people need to see us. They need to see us a few times to feel like they have some rapport with us. I hope this has helped. I'm going to share a couple of handouts, and I would love to hear from my podcast host friends who are also going to be looking at this video. What are the things that you love the most when podcast guests pitch you, or when they publicize their episode? Or is there anything off-putting that you want people to avoid when they are podcast guests? Thank you so much for being here. Thrilled, and I hope this helps. Of course, there are services that are paid, things like, and you can have a free version too. Matchmaker FM. I belong to Podmatch, and I do have an affiliate link if anyone ever wants one to sign up for a paid membership. But I say try free memberships first and see what that does for you, because you know what? That makes it a lot easier. It's like Match.com for podcast hosts to meet the right podcast guest. So a lot of the work is done for you. And that might be just a way to make it easy for yourself. All right. Have a great day and, do let me know if this has helped.